The entire diner went quiet the second Emily Carter walked through the door. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a room decides something about you before you open your mouth. She didn't notice at first. She was carrying a metal bowl of water she'd filled at the outdoor tap, heading back to the old woman sitting alone on the bench outside. Evelyn Brooks, 82 years old in the July heat, and not a single person in Pine Hollow had offered her so much as shade. Then a man's boot came down hard. The bowl flipped. Water spread across the wooden planks. Emily stopped. The man smirked. And that's when the military working dog, a Belgian Malinois she'd never seen before, leashed to a post 20 feet away, stood up, locked its eyes on the man, and didn't move a muscle. Just planted itself between him and Evelyn like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The whole town had been ignoring Evelyn Brooks for 38 years. It took a dog 30 seconds to do what not one of them had bothered to do. If you're watching this story for the first time, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. Emily Carter had arrived in Pine Hollow, Montana 4 days earlier with no plan except to stop moving for a while. 12 years in the Army, 3 deployments, the last one in a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, where the trauma bay was a converted storage tent and the generator cut out twice a week. She'd come home from that tour with both her eardrums intact and a recurring dream about a soldier named Private Delgado who hadn't made it off her table. The Army had called it a successful extraction. She'd called it something else. She wasn't running from Pine Hollow. She'd never heard of Pine Hollow. She'd picked it off a map because it was small, it had a diner, and nobody there would know her name. That part had worked out fine. What she hadn't counted on was Evelyn. She'd spotted the old woman on her second morning in town, sitting outside the hardware store on a wooden bench, eating a sandwich alone. Emily had noticed because the bench had 2 seats, and the man who came out of the hardware store a moment later glanced at Evelyn, visibly hesitated, then carried his coffee all the way to the curb and stood there instead. Like sitting beside her was something you didn't do. Emily had filed it away. Not her business. She was on vacation, technically. She was supposed to be hiking and eating bad pie and not thinking about anything with a pulse. By day 3, she'd seen it happen 4 more times. The woman at the pharmacy who pretended not to hear Evelyn's question about a prescription pickup. The kids who crossed the street before they reached her corner. The cashier at the general store who processed her items without once making eye contact. Emily had spent 12 years reading rooms under pressure. You learned to clock behavior fast when the alternative was missing something that got someone killed. And what she was reading in Pine Hollow had a texture to it that she didn't like. Not random rudeness, not small-town introversion. Something organized, shared, like a rule everyone knew except the person it was aimed at. On the morning of day 4, she'd decided to buy the woman a coffee. Evelyn had looked at her like she was trying to figure out the catch. "Just coffee," Emily said. "I'm Emily. I'm passing through." "Evelyn." A pause. "Most people don't sit here." I noticed. They'd talked for 40 minutes. Evelyn was sharp, careful with her words, and had the particular stillness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that showing too much of herself in public ended badly. She mentioned a garden. She mentioned her late husband, dead 22 years. She did not mention whatever had put her on the outside of this town, and Emily didn't ask. What she did ask was whether Evelyn had eaten lunch, which was how they'd ended up at the diner. Evelyn waiting on the bench outside because the last time she'd gone in, the owner had asked her to leave. Emily inside ordering 2 sandwiches and filling a bowl of water for the dog she'd noticed tied up outside. A big Malinois with a faded vest and the focused, still quality of a working animal that had been well trained and was currently pretending to rest. She didn't know whose dog it was. She'd just figured it was hot and the dog was thirsty. She was carrying the bowl back through the door when the room went quiet. She was 3 steps out when the man's boot came down. His name, she'd find out later, was Gary Pruitt. He ran the auto shop on Crestline Road and had lived in Pine Hollow his entire life. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his late 40s, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone in this zip code. "She shouldn't be out here," he said. Not to Emily, to the air, or maybe to the 4 other men who'd drifted out of the diner behind her. Town bench isn't for everyone. Emily set the empty bowl down. She was 5'4" and hadn't slept more than 5 hours any night that week. Her hair was in a braid that had been neat 4 hours ago. She was wearing hiking boots with a scuff on the left toe from where she'd caught a root on Tuesday's trail, and she had not had enough coffee yet for this particular conversation. "You want to explain that?" she said. "I want to explain that this woman—" He gestured at Evelyn without looking at her, which was somehow worse than looking, "has caused enough trouble in this town. We don't need outsiders stirring things back up. I bought her a sandwich. That's your mistake." One of the men behind him, older, in a feed cap, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Emily looked at Evelyn. The old woman had gone very still, the way you go still when you know what's coming and you've learned it's better not to flinch. She was holding her hands in her lap and her eyes were somewhere past the tree line. "Come on," Emily said to her. "Let's go." "She's not—" "I'm talking to my friend," Emily said, and something in her voice stopped the rest of his sentence before it left his mouth. She'd used that voice in trauma bays. She'd used it with panicking soldiers and with supply officers who thought they outranked a medical emergency. It was not loud. It was very clear. She picked up the empty bowl, walked to where the Malinois was tied, and crouched down to look at him. He'd never stopped watching Gary Pruitt. His ears were forward. His weight was slightly on his front legs. "Hey, buddy," she said quietly. She checked the tag on his vest. "Ranger." The dog's eyes moved to her for exactly 2 seconds, then went back to Pruitt. "Good boy," she said, and meant it. She took Evelyn back to the cottage on the edge of town that the old woman had lived in alone since her husband died. It was small and well kept, with a garden that had been organized with real attention, the kind of attention that was easier to give to plants than to people, when people had made it clear they didn't want it. Evelyn made tea she didn't need and set out cups she wasn't sure how to use anymore, and Emily ate half a sandwich and let the silence run until it was comfortable. "How long?" Emily asked. Evelyn knew what she was asking. 38 years. For what? The old woman was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My son." Emily waited. He was a Marine, Thomas. He served 2 tours and came home and went back for a third. She held her teacup with both hands. The third tour, something happened. They said he... She stopped. They said he gave information to the wrong people, that men died because of it. Was it true? Evelyn looked at her directly for the first time. No. Then why? Because the man who said it was a colonel, and Thomas was a corporal, and no one in this town had any reason to believe a corporal over a colonel, especially when the colonel had served with men's fathers and coached men's sons in Little League. She set the cup down very carefully. So they believed the colonel, and when Thomas died 6 months later in a prison cell waiting for a hearing that never happened, they believed the story that went with that too. Emily's jaw was tight. She made herself unclench it. And you? I stood up at a town meeting and said he was innocent. I had a letter he'd sent me. I had a name, a witness, someone who'd been there who'd told Thomas the orders were wrong, that someone above him was using his patrol as cover for something else. She shook her head. They told me I was a grieving mother who couldn't accept the truth, and after enough years of that, people just stopped looking at me. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Do you still have the letter? Evelyn looked at her. You're not going to tell me to let it go? No. Everyone else does. I'm not everyone else. She drove back into town that evening and ate dinner alone at a different diner. There were 2 in Pine Hollow, and the second one was smaller and had slightly better pie, and she sat in a corner booth and thought about Thomas Brooks, and a colonel whose name she didn't know yet, and 38 years of a woman eating sandwiches on a bench that nobody would share with her. She was not supposed to be doing this. She was supposed to be hiking. She was supposed to be decompressing. Her former CO, Major Doris Satterley, had used the word mandatory when she'd said the word vacation. And Emily had said yes in the tone of voice that meant she'd heard the word without necessarily agreeing to the concept. But there was something here that felt familiar in a way she couldn't put down. Not the injustice. She'd seen injustice before, in plenty of forms. What felt familiar was the pattern. The way a story had locked into place around a person, and everyone had agreed to maintain it, and the person inside the story had stopped being visible as a human being. She'd seen that in the military. She'd seen it with patients who came in coded a certain way before anyone had looked at their chart. She'd seen how fast a label traveled and how slow the correction followed, if it came at all. She ordered a second piece of pie she didn't want and thought about the witness Evelyn had mentioned, the one Thomas had named in his letter. The waitress, a younger woman with tired eyes, refilled her coffee without being asked. "You were in the diner this morning," the woman said, "with Gary." "He was in the diner, I was outside." The waitress almost smiled. Then she put the coffee pot down and leaned against the counter like she was just resting her feet. "You should be careful about getting involved with Evelyn Brooks. Seems like everyone has an opinion about that. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying that things don't go well for people who get too close to her. This is a small town. People remember." "What do they remember?" The waitress looked at her for a moment, then picked the coffee pot back up. "The Marine," she said, "what he did, and what she won't admit." "And if she's right that he didn't do it?" Silence. "Has anyone actually looked at the record?" Emily asked. "Not the story, the actual record." The waitress moved away to check on another table and didn't come back. So she went back to Evelyn's cottage the next morning. The letter was in a cedar box under the bed, wrapped in a cloth that had been washed enough times it had gone soft. There were more things in the box than Evelyn had mentioned, not because she'd been hiding them, Emily thought, but because she'd stopped looking at them, the way you stop looking at something that only makes the wound open again. 2 letters in Thomas's handwriting, a photograph of him in dress uniform, maybe 24 years old, standing next to a woman Emily recognized as a much younger Evelyn. A folded page that turned out to be a copy of a witness statement, handwritten, signed by a name Emily didn't recognize, Corporal D. Wren, that described a specific incident involving a senior officer diverting patrol routes to create cover for unauthorized contact with a local asset. And at the bottom of the box, under everything else, a piece of paper with a name and a town written in Evelyn's handwriting, because she'd looked into this herself once, before the town made it clear she should stop. Daniel Hayes, former CID, Mesa Ridge, Arizona. Emily held the paper for a long time. "You found him?" she asked. "I tried to write to him 26 years ago." Evelyn was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, not against the cold, it was July, but the way you hold yourself when you're waiting for something to hurt. "He never wrote back." "That doesn't mean he won't talk." "Emily." The old woman's voice was careful. "I've lived with this for 38 years. I stopped needing it to be fixed a long time ago. I just needed someone to not look through me when I sat down." "I hear you," Emily said. "But I'm not talking about what you need. I'm talking about what's true." Evelyn looked at her for a long time. "You have no idea what this town will do to you if you start asking questions," she said. "I've been in worse towns," Emily said, which was true. "And they didn't have good pie." She drove back toward the main road and stopped at the hardware store, not to buy anything, but because Corporal Wren's statement mentioned a supply order that had been processed through a civilian contractor, and she had a vague, non-specific hunch that supply chains in small Montana towns tended to circle back to the same handful of businesses. She was looking at the display of work gloves near the front window when the owner came out from the back. He was somewhere in his 60s, square face, the kind of man who shook hands like it was a test. "Can I help you?" "Just browsing." He looked at her without any particular friendliness. "You're the woman from the diner yesterday." "That was me." "You're staying at the Millbrook rental." It wasn't a question, which told her the town had already been talking about her. Small towns track strangers automatically. She knew that. It wasn't sinister on its own. But the way he'd said it had a quality to it, like he was marking her location. "I am," she said. "You should know," he said, "that whatever Evelyn Brooks has been telling you isn't the whole story." "I'd love to hear the rest of it." He paused. "The rest isn't for outsiders." "Then maybe an outsider's the right person to hear it." He didn't say anything else. Emily put down the work gloves she wasn't planning to buy and walked out. She sat in her car for a moment and pulled out her phone. CID stood for Criminal Investigation Division, military. If Daniel Hayes had been an investigator on Thomas Brooks's case and then disappeared from the official record, that was not an accident. CID investigators didn't accidentally fall out of records. Someone had made a decision about what his name was allowed to be attached to. She typed Daniel Hayes, Mesa Ridge, Arizona into her search and got nothing useful, which was itself useful information. Then she pulled up the number for the Army Human Resources Command and started making calls. She reached someone on the fourth call. Not Hayes, a records assistant who confirmed, in the careful way of someone who had learned not to say too much over the phone, that a Daniel Hayes had in fact been part of the investigative team on a matter involving an individual named Thomas Brooks, and that the case had been closed, and that she could submit a formal records request through the appropriate channels, which would take 6 to 8 weeks. Emily thanked her politely and said she'd be in touch. She drove back to the Millbrook rental and sat on the porch steps and listened to a woodpecker somewhere in the tree line and thought. 6 to 8 weeks. She had 11 days left of what Major Satterley had called a mandatory vacation. She could file the request. She could let whatever process existed grind along at its own speed. She could finish her pie, drive out of Pine Hollow, and never know whether Daniel Hayes had anything worth saying. She looked at the name and the Arizona town on the piece of paper she'd set on the porch railing. She picked it up and went inside to look at flights. What? She was packing a bag when she heard the knock. It was Gary Pruitt. He was not alone. The man in the feed cap from the diner was with him. And a third one she didn't recognize, younger, with the sunburned neck of someone who worked outside. Pruitt had his hands in his jacket pockets and a specific expression on his face that she had seen before, in certain kinds of men, in certain situations. The look of someone who had decided to make a point before the other person got the chance to make one. Going somewhere? He said. Didn't know that was anyone's business. This is a small town. Things are everyone's business. What do you want, Gary? The use of his first name casually threw him off just slightly. She saw it. He recovered fast. I want you to understand something, he said. Evelyn Brooks has been trying to reopen a box that's been closed for almost 40 years. Every time someone new comes to town and she gets in their ear, things get complicated. For everyone. Complicated how? People lose trust. People start asking questions that hurt businesses, hurt families. People who did nothing wrong get their names dragged back into something that was settled a long time ago. Emily looked at him. Settled meaning someone decided it was over, or settled meaning it was actually resolved. His jaw tightened. Meaning it's done. I hear you, she said. Is that all? He stared at her for a moment. You're making a mistake. Probably. She looked past him at the other two men, neither of whom had said anything. The younger one with the sunburned neck was looking at the ground. Was there something else? Pruitt turned and walked back toward the road. The man in the feed cap followed. The younger one paused at the edge of the porch steps and looked up at her. He's not wrong that things get complicated, the man said, quieter, but he's also not... He stopped. Never mind. He walked away before she could ask him to finish. McCool. She went back inside and kept packing. She'd made 2 mistakes in 12 years of Army service that she would genuinely categorize as mistakes. Not tactical decisions that went wrong, not judgment calls under pressure, but actual mistakes, where she'd had information and hadn't acted on it. She wasn't making a third. She was zipping the bag when she heard a sound outside. Not from the road, from the side yard. She went to the window. The Malinois was sitting in her side yard. Not tied, just sitting there, watching the front of the house, relaxed but very present, with the vest still on and no owner in sight. Emily stared at the dog for a long moment. She went outside. Ranger, she'd already started thinking of him by the name on his vest, which was probably a mistake, lifted his head and watched her approach. His tail moved once, a single slow sweep. "Where's your person?" she said. The dog didn't answer that question, obviously. She crouched down and looked at the vest more carefully. There was a tag on the back panel she hadn't seen before, smaller than the name tag, more worn. She tilted it toward the porch light. K9 Unit /75th Rangers /Fort Kaysen. She sat back on her heels. Fort Kaysen. That was a real installation. That was a specific unit. This wasn't a retired civilian working dog. This was an active duty animal, or close to it, and it was sitting in her yard in Pine Hollow, Montana at 9 o'clock at night without anyone attached to its lead. She looked around the yard, the road, the tree line. Nothing. When she looked back, the dog was still watching the tree line too, ears slightly forward, with that particular focused stillness of a trained animal that has identified something it has decided to keep track of. "Okay," Emily said quietly, and something moved in her chest that wasn't quite fear. "Okay." She went inside and picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in 14 months. It rang 3 times. "Satterley? It's Carter." A pause. "I thought you were on vacation." "I am. I need you to run a name for me." She looked out the window at the dog in the yard. "And I need you to tell me why there's a 75th Ranger K9 unit sitting in my yard in a town of 400 people in the middle of Montana." Another pause, longer. "Say that last part again," Satterley said, and her voice had shifted into the register Emily recognized from operation briefings. Careful, full attention, the sound of someone who had just realized a situation was something other than what it had appeared to be. Satterley didn't answer right away, which meant she was already doing something on the other end. Emily could hear the specific quiet of a person who has stopped breathing casually and started breathing carefully. "Carter," she said finally, "what's the dog's vest say exactly?" 75th Rangers, Fort Cason. Name tag reads Ranger. "And no handler?" "No handler, no vehicle I can see. He showed up about 20 minutes ago, and he's been watching the tree line since." The pause this time was shorter. "Stay inside. I'll call you back in 10. She hung up before Emily could ask anything else. Emily stood at the window and watched the dog and thought about what it meant that her former commanding officer had said, "Stay inside," instead of "Are you sure?" or "That's probably just someone's pet," or any of the other things a person said, when the thing you described was not actually a concern. Satterley was precise with language. She didn't say things she didn't mean. She'd said, "Stay inside." Emily turned off the porch light and moved away from the window. She did not stay inside. She sat on the floor of the front hallway, back against the wall, where she could see the front door and the side window both, and waited. Satterley called back in 7 minutes. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to not ask me how I know it yet. Okay? Pine Hollow has been on a watch list for 11 months. Low priority, no active operation, just flagged. Something related to a cold case that got kicked up through a records audit. A closed military investigation from the late 80s that had some anomalies when the audit system ran it." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. "Thomas Brooks." Silence. "You already know the name?" Satterley said. "I've been talking to his mother." Another pause, longer this time, with a different texture. "Emily, how long have you been in that town?" 5 days. "And you're already—" She stopped. "The K9 unit isn't there for you. There's a 2-man team doing a discrete assessment of the area. They've been there 3 days. The dog got loose from the vehicle about an hour ago, that's an embarrassment that someone is going to hear about. But Rangers trained to seek, and apparently what he found was you. Why is there a team here at all if it's low priority? Because low priority doesn't mean no priority. It means we haven't found the thread yet." A beat. "Until apparently you sat down and had coffee with the right person." Emily looked at the dark window. "There's a witness statement in Evelyn Brooks's cedar box. Corporal D. Wren. Original, handwritten, signed. It describes a senior officer using a patrol for unauthorized cover. That statement never made it into the official record. The silence on the other end was the kind that had weight. "I'm going to need you to not touch anything else in that box," Satterley said slowly, "and I'm going to need you to stay available. Can you do that?" "I was about to fly to Arizona." "Arizona." "Daniel Hayes, former CID. He investigated the case. His name's in Evelyn's handwriting on a piece of paper at the bottom of the box." The exhale Satterley made was long and controlled. "Of course it is." Another beat. "Carter, listen to me carefully. What you're describing, if the records audit found what I think it found, and if that statement says what you're telling me it says, this isn't a cold case anymore. This is an active file. You understand what that means? It means I stopped doing this alone. It means you stopped doing this at all, officially, unofficially. Satterley's voice dropped a register. I need 48 hours. Don't fly anywhere. Don't take the statement out of the house. And if anyone in that town asks you direct questions about what you found nothing. What about Hayes? Let me find Hayes first. Emily sat with that for a moment. Outside, she heard Ranger shift position, the small sounds of a large dog resettling, a soft exhale. Still there, still watching. 48 hours, she said. 48 hours, Satterley confirmed, and hung up. She didn't sleep much. That wasn't unusual. She'd had patchy sleep for 2 years, nothing alarming, just the low hum of a brain that had spent too long being responsible for other people's lives and hadn't fully downshifted yet. She lay on the rental bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thomas Brooks, 24 years old in a dress uniform, standing next to his mother, who had not yet become the woman the town looked through. In the morning, Ranger was gone. She made coffee and sat on the porch steps and thought about the younger man from last night, the one with the sunburned neck who'd started to say something and then stopped. He's not wrong that things get complicated, but he's also not wrong. Not wrong. Something in between, which was the most interesting place to look. She took her coffee and walked to the hardware store when it opened. The sunburned man was there, loading bags of something into the back of a truck in the alley beside the building. He saw her coming, and his expression did the thing faces do when a person is trying to decide whether to be unavailable. I'm not here to cause trouble, Emily said. You're going to anyway. Probably. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk, not close enough to crowd. Last night you started to say something. I'd like to hear the rest of it. He kept loading, one bag, then another. I work for Gary. You understand that? I understand that. Meaning there's a limit to what I can say that doesn't come back to me. I'm not writing anything down. He stopped, set the bag down and straightened up and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been holding something for a long time and was only now considering whether the weight was worth it. He was younger than she'd thought last night, maybe 32, 33. Calloused hands. A scar on the left forearm she recognized, without wanting to, as a burn. My grandfather knew Thomas Brooks, he said. Not well. They grew up on the same road. When everything happened, when the accusation came out, my grandfather was one of the men at the town meeting where Evelyn stood up. Emily waited. He told me when I was 17 that Evelyn had a name, a witness, and that the colonel's people showed up at that meeting and said if anyone looked into the witness claim, the investigation into Thomas would expand to include everyone who'd had contact with him in the 6 months prior. He picked up the bag again. My grandfather knew Thomas, so did 2 other men at that meeting. They backed down. They had families. Emily nodded. She wasn't going to tell him that was wrong. She didn't know what she would have done at a town meeting in 1987 with the colonel's people in the room and her family's name on the line. She'd like to think she knew. She wasn't sure. The witness Evelyn mentioned, she said, Corporal Wren. Do you know if anyone ever found him? I know my grandfather tried to find him about 10 years later. He'd gotten it in his head that he owed Thomas something. He found a name, but not a person. He set the last bag down. The address came back to a VA facility outside Billings. Someone who'd been there told him Wren had been discharged to a private address, and the file was sealed. Emily filed that away. Sealed via file, post-discharge, no forwarding contact. That was one of 2 things. Either the man had been disappeared or he'd been protected. What's your name? She asked. He hesitated. Nate. Nate. She looked at him. Your grandfather, is he still alive? He's 80. He's got his bad days. But some good ones. Something crossed his face. Some good ones. I'm not going to use his name anywhere, she said. I'm not going to come to his house. But if there's something he's been carrying that he'd want someone else to know, she left that open. Nate didn't say yes. He also didn't say no. He picked up his work gloves from the truck bed and pulled them on. Maple Creek Road, he said without looking at her. 3rd house past the grain elevator. He's up by 6. He walked back into the alley without another word. She went to Evelyn's first. The old woman answered the door in a garden apron that had seen years of real use, not the decorative kind, and she had a smudge of dirt on her wrist that she hadn't noticed yet. She looked at Emily with an expression that mixed something like relief with something like apprehension, the way you look at good news when you've learned not to trust it. "I need to tell you something," Emily said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you decide how you feel about it." Evelyn stepped back and let her in. Emily told her about Satterley, about the records audit, about the flag on the case. She didn't tell her about the K9 unit or the detail that was apparently already in town. That felt like information that belonged to Satterley's 48 hours, not hers to distribute. But she told her about Wren's statement, that she'd looked at it, that she'd told someone with authority about its existence. Evelyn sat very still through all of it. "They already knew something was wrong," she said when Emily finished. "Something triggered a review. What you have in that box might be what connects the trigger to the actual record." 38 years, Evelyn said. Not bitterly. More like she was measuring a distance. "I know. I wrote to every office I could find, the congressman twice, the VA. I called a number I found for the Army Inspector General, and the woman who answered said she'd take a message, and I never heard back." She looked at her hands. "I stopped 12 years ago. I told myself Thomas didn't need me to keep bleeding over it, that wherever he was, he knew I'd tried." "You never stopped believing him?" "No." Simple. Clean. "No, I never did that." Emily looked at the cedar box on the shelf by the window, where Evelyn had moved it the night before after they'd looked through it together. "The Army is going to want to look at that statement," she said. "Not now, not for another day or two. But when they do, I want you to be ready, and I want you to have someone with you. Not me, necessarily, someone in your corner with a clear head." Evelyn almost smiled. "I don't have a lot of those. Is there anyone?" A pause. "The pastor at Ridgeline Lutheran. He's newer. He came after most of this had calcified." She paused again. "He never looked through me." "Good," Emily said. "Call him today. Don't tell him specifics. Just tell him you might need him available in the next few days." Evelyn nodded slowly. Then she looked at Emily with the directness she'd shown once or twice before. The Evelyn underneath the careful one. The one who had once stood up at a town meeting and said, "My son is innocent," in front of a colonel's people. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You came here to hike." Emily thought about that honestly. "Because I recognize the shape of it," she said. "What happened to Thomas? What happened to you? I've seen it in smaller forms inside the service, and I never had enough leverage to do anything. I have more here." It wasn't the whole answer. Part of the answer was Private Delgado and the dream she still had, and the specific weight of someone who didn't make it off your table because someone above you made the wrong call, and the system protected the call instead of the person. But that part wasn't Evelyn's to carry, so she kept it. "All right," Evelyn said. "All right, that's it." She drove out to Maple Creek Road at 6:15. The third house past the grain elevator was a low farmhouse with a truck in the drive that had been kept up even though it was old, and the man sitting on the porch was clearly Nate's grandfather. Same jaw, same stillness, the whole frame of him reduced by time but not diminished. He was drinking coffee and watching the fields like they owed him something. His name was Harold Briggs, and he didn't seem surprised to see her, which meant Nate had called ahead, and that meant more than the visit itself. "Nate said you're ex-military," Harold said when she sat down in the other chair. "Army, 12 years, combat nursing." He nodded like that was one kind of answer. "Thomas Brooks was a good kid. I knew him since he was 8 years old. Used to ride his bike past this house every day in summer." Emily didn't say anything. She let the man go at his own pace. "When they said what they said about him, my first thought was that it was wrong. Not hope, thought. I knew that kid. And what they described, the way they described it," he shook his head, "didn't fit. But by the time I had enough nerve to say so out loud, the machinery was already rolling, and Evelyn had already been to the meeting, and the colonel's people had already done what they did." "What exactly did they do?" He looked at her sideways. "You want the specific version. I want the true one." He was quiet for a moment, watching the fields. After Evelyn's testimony at the meeting, there was a man who came around. Not military, no uniform, but the way he talked, you could tell. He went to 3 families that I know of and told them that the investigation was going to look at everyone Thomas had contact with, that if names got attached to questions, those names would become part of the file. He paused. He came here too. And you backed down. I had a son, Nate's father. He was 22, just starting out. Yeah. He set his coffee down. I backed down, and Thomas died in a holding facility 6 months later waiting for a hearing, and I have had to live with that for 38 years. Emily looked at him. The man who came around, can you describe him? Harold thought. Mid-40s, dark hair. He had a ring, army-class ring, but older than he looked, like he'd inherited it. He gave me a name, but I knew it was fake because of the way he said it. Too smooth. Did he ever come back? Once. About 5 years later, around the time a newspaper in Billings picked up the story. Small piece, not front page, but someone had been asking questions. He came back and he reminded me that my family's name was still in that file if anyone went looking. Harold looked at his hands. After that, I didn't hear from him again. Emily filed the detail about the Billings newspaper away. That was something to find. A story published 5 years after Thomas's death, which meant someone outside Pine Hollow had been suspicious enough to look, even if the article had been small. Harold, she said, do you know the name Colonel? She didn't have the Colonel's name yet. The officer who made the original accusation. Do you know who he was? He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his breast pocket and took out a folded piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times the creases were almost separations. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a name, Colonel Vernon Ashe, and below the name in Harold's handwriting, retired Scottsdale, Arizona, 2019. She looked up. How long have you had this? 6 years. He took the paper back, refolded it. I hired a private investigator. Old man's money, didn't know what else to do with it. He found the name and the retirement location, and then I sat on it because I didn't know what to do next, and I was 80 years old. He's in Scottsdale, Emily said. Daniel Hayes, the CID investigator from the original case, he's in Mesa Ridge. Harold looked at her. That's 40 minutes from Scottsdale. I know, she said. She drove back to the rental and sat in the car, and did not call Satterley immediately, which she knew was technically what she was supposed to do. She sat there for 4 minutes and thought about a 48-hour hold and an active file, and the particular way things moved inside military systems when they moved at all, which was slowly, carefully, with 10 forms where 3 would do. Then she thought about Evelyn Brooks eating a sandwich alone in July heat. She called Satterley. I have a name, she said when it connected. Colonel Vernon Ashe. Retired. Currently Scottsdale, Arizona. He's the officer who made the original accusation against Thomas Brooks, and he's 40 minutes from where Daniel Hayes is living. The silence on Satterley's end was the specific silence of someone recalibrating. Carter. There was a Billings newspaper piece about 5 years after Thomas died. Someone was looking into the case from the outside. I need to find that article. Emily. Satterley's voice was measured now, the one she used when she was applying deliberate calm to a situation she was less than calm about. The team here in Pine Hollow, I'm going to pull them in today. This moves to an official track as of this morning, which means, it means I step back. It means you step back. Emily looked out the windshield at the main road, at the diner with its hand-painted sign, at the bench outside the hardware store where Evelyn sat alone. The banker, she said. There's a banker in town. I don't have his name yet, but Harold Briggs mentioned that there was a man with a class ring who came around threatening families. Someone local had to have been the conduit between the colonel's operation and Pine Hollow. A banker makes sense. He would have access to enough leverage over enough people. Satterley was quiet. That's not nothing, Emily said. No, Satterley agreed. That's not nothing. A pause. Give me everything you have. Harold Briggs's name, the witness statement location, the Ashe connection, the Billings piece, all of it. Then I need you to take an actual walk in those mountains you supposedly came here for and let the process run. And if the process runs slowly, then I'll move it, Satterley said simply. I have Ash's name now, and Hayes's location, and a witness statement that apparently never made the record. That's not a cold case anymore, Carter. That's a burning building. I can work with a burning building. Emily exhaled. Okay. Okay meaning you'll actually step back? Okay meaning I'll take a walk. That's not... Satterley made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Fine. Take your walk. Stay in cell range. Oh. She almost made it to the trailhead. She was 200 yards from the parking area at the base of Greystone Trail when the silver SUV she'd seen parked twice outside her rental in the last 4 days pulled to a slow stop on the road beside her. The window went down. The man behind the wheel was not Gary Pruitt. He was somewhere in his 60s, well-dressed for a small Montana town, pressed shirt, clean hands, with the kind of face that managed to look pleasant and say nothing at the same time. Emily had met faces like that before. They tended to belong to people who had learned that pleasantness was a more effective tool than aggression. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I was hoping to catch you before you left town." She stopped walking. "I don't think we've met." "Warren Howell." A pause, as if the name should mean something. "I manage the community bank here. I've been a part of this town my entire life." He said it without pride or apology, just fact. "I heard you've been spending time with Evelyn Brooks." "I have." "I wanted to offer some context, if you're open to it, from someone who's been here through the whole history." Emily looked at him. She thought about Satterley saying step back. She thought about the Billings newspaper article and Colonel Vernon Ashe in Scottsdale and the class ring that was older than the man wearing it. "I'm listening," she said. He nodded and reached over and opened the passenger door. She did not get in the car. She stayed where she was on the road shoulder with her feet on solid ground and her phone in her jacket pocket and her eyes on his hands. "That's all right," he said, adjusting smoothly. "I can say this here. What I wanted you to know is that Evelyn's version of events, I don't doubt she believes it. Grief does things to memory. Thomas was her son and she loved him. But the people who were here, who knew the situation, the investigation was thorough. The outcome, as painful as it was correct. You were at the town meeting." A slight pause. "I was." "And you heard Evelyn's testimony." "I did." "And the witness she named, Corporal Wren, did anyone follow up on that?" He looked at her with the pleasantness fully intact, like a mask so well fitted it had become a face. "I'm not sure that name came up in any official capacity." "It came up at the town meeting." Evelyn said it, your town meeting. "There was a lot said that night. Grief makes people reach for anything." Emily looked at him for a moment. The trees behind him were very still. A truck went past on the main road 200 yards back. "Mr. Howell," she said, "did your family have a locked chest?" The pleasantness shifted. Not dropped, just shifted, like something tightening underneath it. "I'm sorry?" "Old families in small towns. Sometimes they have things they hold on to, documents, old correspondence, things they were asked to keep safe by people with more authority than them." She kept her voice level. "I was just curious." He looked at her for a long moment that had a different quality to it than his earlier looks, less pleasant, more calculating. "You should be careful about the conclusions you draw," he said, "when you don't have the full picture." "I keep trying to get the full picture," Emily said. "People keep giving me pieces." He pulled the passenger door shut. "Enjoy your hike, Ms. Carter." The window went up. The SUV moved slowly back toward town. Emily stood on the road shoulder and watched it go and felt, with the particular certainty of a trained instinct, that she had just made something happen that was now moving in a direction she couldn't fully see yet. She pulled out her phone and called Satterley before she'd even turned back toward the trailhead. "Warren Howell," she said. "Community Bank, Pine Hollow. He just pulled up next to me on an empty road and told me Evelyn's grief distorts her memory." "He approached you?" "Unsolicited. He knew my name. He said he'd been hoping to catch me." The sound on Satterley's end was someone typing fast. "He's been watching you," Satterley said. "He's been watching me." "For how long?" 4 days minimum. Silver SUV. I clocked it twice before today and didn't flag it because small towns track strangers," Satterley finished. Yeah. Carter, listen to me. Go to the trailhead. Sit on a rock. Do not go back into town without calling me first. Is there something I should know? There might be something I need to confirm first. The records audit, the anomaly that flagged Pine Hollow originally, it flagged a financial discrepancy attached to the case file, a civilian contractor payment in 1988. The contractor's registration came back to a shell company, and the shell company's registered agent was... She stopped. I'm still pulling the thread, but a bank would be the right place to run a shell company through. Emily looked down the empty road. His father, she said quietly. It was his father, wasn't it? The man with the class ring who threatened the families. Go to the trailhead, Carter. Satterley. I'm not asking. Go. Emily went. She sat on a rock at the trailhead for 22 minutes, watching the tree line in the way that had become automatic after 12 years, clocking movement and stillness and the difference between a random bird and something that wasn't random. And she thought about Warren Howell's face when she'd said the words locked chest, the way the pleasantness had shifted, and what it meant that he'd known her name. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No name. The Billings Tribune. August 14th, 1993, page 7. Reporter named Gail Turrow. She found Wren. Emily stared at the message. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came in under 10 seconds. Someone who's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right questions. She typed back, "Who are you?" The reply didn't come in 10 seconds this time. It came in 4 minutes, which felt different, like someone picking up something they'd set down a long time ago and checking whether it still had weight. My name is Dennis Wren. I'm 71 years old and I've been clean for 19 years, and I need you to know that before anything else. Emily read that twice. Then she stood up from the rock and started walking, not toward the trail, back toward her car. How did you get this number? Army Records Audit flagged my sealed VA file 3 weeks ago. Someone called me. A Major Satterley. She told me there might be movement on a case I'd been part of. She gave me your number in case I had information I wanted to share outside official channels first. A pause. Then, I've been sitting on your contact for 2 weeks. Couldn't make myself call. Then I heard you found my statement. Emily stopped walking. Satterley had given Wren her number 2 weeks ago. Satterley had been working this longer than the 48 hours she'd asked Emily to wait, which meant the conversation about stepping back had been as much about managing Emily as it had been about process. She wasn't angry. She understood the calculation. She was impressed and a little irritated simultaneously, which was the standard state of knowing Doris Satterley. She typed, "I found your statement. Original copy, signed. It's in Evelyn Brooks's cedar box in Pine Hollow." The reply? She kept it. She kept everything. A long pause. Then, the Billings Tribune piece. Page 7, August 1993. Reporter Gail Turrow interviewed me in the parking lot of a Denny's outside Billings because I was too scared to meet anywhere closer to Pine Hollow. I told her what I knew. She wrote it. It ran once, and then the Tribune's editor got a call, and the digital archive was removed 3 months later. But print copies still exist. The Billings Public Library keeps physical copies of every issue going back to 1960. Emily was at her car now. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. "Did you see what happened? Were you there when the order came down?" "I was in the room. I heard Colonel Ash give the order. I heard him tell Thomas that the patrol route change was authorized from above. It wasn't. I found out later because I tried to verify it through my own sergeant, and the authorization didn't exist anywhere in the chain. Thomas followed an order he was told was legitimate. He had no idea what Ash was using the patrol as his cover for." "What was Ash using it for?" Another long pause. "I need to talk to someone official before I say that part. I've been saying the small part for 30 years and it cost me everything I had. The big part..." He stopped. "I need to know it's going somewhere before I let go of it." Emily stared at the screen for a moment. Then she called Satterley. Satterley picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "You gave Wren my number 2 weeks ago," Emily said. "I did." "And you told me 48 hours and step back." "I did that too. No apology in it, just acknowledgement." "He's texting me right now. He was in the room when Ash gave the order. He says he knows what Ash was using the patrol for, and he won't say it until he's talking to someone official. Get me on a three-way call with him in the next 10 minutes, Satterley said. I'm already mobile. The call lasted 47 minutes. Emily sat in her car at the trailhead and listened to Dennis Wren's voice, rougher than she'd expected from the texts, the voice of a man who had smoked for decades and quit, lay out what he'd been carrying for 38 years with the particular deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the telling so many times the sequence had become a kind of script, but the emotion underneath it was still raw, still present, surfacing in the pauses. Colonel Vernon Ash had been running an unauthorized asset, a local national informant he'd cultivated outside official channels, because official channels required documentation and oversight, and Ash had not wanted either. The informant had information on a weapons cache that Ash believed he could leverage into an early promotion. He'd used Thomas Brooks' patrol to create a cover route that allowed him to make contact with the informant without it appearing in any official log. The contact had gone wrong. The informant had been compromised. 3 men from a different unit had died in an ambush connected to the exposed asset. Ash had needed a reason for the patrol route change that didn't lead back to him. Thomas Brooks, 23 years old and following orders he'd been told were legitimate, had been the cleanest available reason. Dennis Wren had tried to give a statement. He'd given one, formally, to the investigating team, the team that included Daniel Hayes. 3 weeks later, he'd been told his statement had been reviewed and found insufficient to alter the investigation's findings. He'd asked to see the record. He'd been told it wasn't available to him. When he pushed, the sealed VA file had appeared, and with it a diagnosis that had made everything he said afterward easy to dismiss. They didn't have to destroy me, Wren said near the end of the call. They just had to make me unreliable. And a long pause. I made it easier for them. I wasn't handling things well anyway. I gave them material to work with. Satterley's voice was steady. Mr. Wren, the statement you gave the original investigation team, do you know the name of the officer you gave it to? Hayes, Wren said. Daniel Hayes. He was a CID warrant officer. He wrote it down while I talked. He was... Another pause. He looked at me like he believed me. I never forgot that. Someone looked at me like they believed me, and then the statement disappeared and I never heard from him again. Emily looked out the windshield at the mountains. I'm going to need you to be available for a formal interview, Satterley said, within the next 72 hours. Can you get to Denver? I can get to Denver. I'm going to have someone contact you by end of day with logistics. Don't discuss this call with anyone else until you hear from my office. After they hung up, Satterley stayed on the line with Emily for another 2 minutes. Hayes, Emily said. I know. He wrote the statement down and then his name disappeared from the official record, which means either Hayes was part of the cover-up or he found out his own work had been buried and he ran, Satterley said. Mesa Ridge, Arizona. He's been there for 22 years. Emily, I need to send someone to Hayes. Send me. The silence on Satterley's end was the kind Emily had learned to wait out. You're not active, Satterley said finally. No, but I'm already packed. I know the case better than anyone you can put on a plane tonight. And if Hayes has been hiding for 22 years because he's afraid of what Ash's people can do to him, a familiar face is going to open that door faster than a badge. You don't have a familiar face. You've never met Hayes. I have Evelyn Brooks' face. I have Thomas Brooks' name. That's familiar enough. Another pause. Commercial flight. Your own money, Satterley said. You're a private citizen following up a personal matter. Nothing official. You record nothing without his explicit consent. You promise nothing on behalf of the Army, and you call me the second you have eyes on him. Understood. Emily, Satterley's voice shifted slightly. Hayes is old. He's been carrying this a long time. Be careful how you go in. I will. She booked the flight from her car. There was one that connected through Salt Lake with a 90-minute layover that got her into Tucson by 9 p.m. Mesa Ridge was 40 minutes from Tucson. She texted Evelyn before she started the car. I have to go out of town for a few days. I'll explain when I get back. Don't talk to Warren Howell. If he approaches you, be polite and say nothing. The reply came after a minute. All right.
Be careful. Then, after another pause, Thomas would have liked you. Emily set the phone down and drove.
Mesa Ridge was the kind of small Arizona city that existed at the edge of something larger without quite being absorbed by it. Strip malls and retirement communities, and a particular dry light that made everything look slightly bleached. She got in late, slept badly in a motel off the highway, and drove to the address she had for Daniel Hayes at 7 in the morning because she'd learned in 12 years that people who had been scared for a long time were more honest before 8 a.m. than after. The defenses hadn't fully reassembled yet. The house was a small adobe-style rental near a wash, surrounded by the kind of gravel landscaping that required no upkeep, which told her something about the man inside, someone who had arranged his life to require as little maintenance as possible. She knocked. Silence. Long enough that she thought he wasn't home or wasn't answering. Then the sound of movement, deliberate and slow, and the door opened on the chain. The man who looked at her through the gap was somewhere in his mid-70s, older than she'd expected from the case date, which meant he'd been in his late 30s when Thomas Brooks died. He had the careful eyes of someone who had spent a long time expecting the wrong person to show up at his door. "Daniel Hayes," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" "My name is Emily Carter. I'm a former Army combat nurse. I've been in Pine Hollow, Montana for the last week talking to Evelyn Brooks, and I found your name at the bottom of a cedar box." The silence behind the chain was absolute. "I also have Dennis Wren on record," she said, quieter. "He talked yesterday. He said you looked at him like you believed him." The chain came off the door. Hayes's kitchen was the kitchen of a man who ate alone and didn't see the point of making it comfortable. One mug, a coffee maker that was clean from use rather than care. He poured her coffee she hadn't asked for and sat across the table from her and looked at her hands the way people look at someone when they're deciding whether to trust them and have run out of alternatives. "I've been waiting," he said, "for either someone official or someone not official. I could never decide which was safer." "I'm somewhere in between," Emily said honestly. "I have a connection to someone official who knows I'm here, but I'm not here in any formal capacity." He nodded slowly. "How is she?" "Evelyn. She's alive. She's sharp. She sat alone on a bench in the July heat for 38 years, and she never stopped believing her son." Hayes put both hands around his mug and looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that she let the silence run. "I wrote the statement," he said. "I took Wren's testimony and I wrote it up and I filed it through the proper channel, which was my supervising officer, a lieutenant colonel named Brandt. 3 weeks later, Brandt called me in and told me the statement had been reviewed and that there were concerns about Wren's reliability and that the investigation was proceeding along its established track." He paused. "I asked to see the case file. Brandt said I didn't have clearance for the full file." That didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. A CID investigator who doesn't have clearance for his own case file. He shook his head. "I started making copies. Everything I had. Everything I'd personally generated. I put them in an envelope and I mailed them to a postal box I'd opened under a different name in Phoenix because I'd been doing this job long enough to know that when something stops making sense in a specific way, you keep your evidence somewhere it can't be reached." Emily looked at him. "Those copies still exist?" "Everyone," he said quietly. Something moved in her chest, not relief exactly, more like the feeling of a structure holding under load, the sensation of something that was supposed to be there turning out to actually be there. "Why didn't you ever come forward?" she asked. "After you left the service? Because Brandt didn't just close the file." Hayes looked at her steadily. "He told me, the last day I reported for duty before my discharge, that there were 2 versions of my career record. One was the version that reflected a competent, decorated investigator. The other had some anomalies. He said which version traveled with me through life depended on the choices I made." He paused. "I was 41. I had a daughter in college. He stopped. "I made the wrong choice." Emily didn't tell him it was understandable. She didn't tell him he'd had no options. Both of those things were partially true, and both of them were beside the point at this particular kitchen table. "The copies," she said. "Can I see them?"
He got up from the table without answering and went into the back of the house. She heard a door open, closet or back room, and the sounds of movement. When he came back, he was carrying a flat archival box, the kind you got from an office supply store, gray with a snap lid. He set it on the table between them. Inside were documents in plastic sleeves, organized with the careful precision of a man who had pulled them out and put them back enough times to have developed a system. She could see immediately that the organization was chronological. The top document was dated March 1988. "The original filed statement is gone," Hayes said, "but this is my working copy with my own notation. This," he pointed to a second sleeve, "is the authorization request I filed to see the full case file, with Brandt's handwritten denial on it. And this," a third sleeve, "is the routing record showing that the statement went to Brandt's office and never came back out." Emily looked at the routing record. It was a carbon copy on Army form paper, the kind that had been used before digital systems replaced them. Someone's initials at the top, a timestamp, and the word received with no corresponding distributed or filed. "Brandt," she said, "where is he now?" Hayes's expression changed slightly. "He died in 2009, cardiac arrest. He was 68. "Who was above Brandt?" "Officially? A general named Pryor, who retired in 1995 and died in 2011. He paused. "But Brandt reported to Ash on the operational side outside the formal chain. It wasn't documented. I found evidence of it in the financial records. There were per diem payments to Brandt that traced to a discretionary account in Ash's control." Emily's phone buzzed. She looked at it, Satterly, and held up one finger to Hayes, who nodded. She stepped to the kitchen doorway. "I have Hayes. He has copies. Everything." Satterly's exhale was audible. "How much?" "Enough. The original statement's working copy, the routing record showing it went to Brandt and stopped, financial connection between Brandt and Ash's discretionary account." She lowered her voice. "He mailed everything to a secure address before he left the service. He's had it for 35 years. "I need those documents in official hands today," Satterly said. "Not copies of copies. The originals." "I know." Emily looked back into the kitchen, where Hayes was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the archival box with the expression of a man who has decided to let go of something heavy and is discovering the weight is still there as he releases it. "Give me an hour with him first." "1 hour," Satterly said. She went back to the table and sat down. "There are people who are ready to receive this," she said. "Today. This moves to an official investigation, a real one, fully resourced, the moment these documents are authenticated. Thomas Brooks's record gets corrected. Evelyn gets her son back, at least on paper." Hayes looked at her. "And Ash?" "He's 81 years old. He's in Scottsdale." She paused. "Justice doesn't always look the way we want it to at 81. "I know that." Hayes was quiet. "I just need to know that someone has to say his name. Formally. On record. I need the record to have his name on it." "It will." He looked at the box, then at her. "You said you were a combat nurse. 12 years. You ever lose someone you shouldn't have?" She held his gaze. "Yes." "Does it—" He stopped. "Does it get less, eventually?" She thought about Private Delgado, the storage tent, the generator cutting out. "It gets different," she said honestly. "It doesn't get less. But different is something you can live with." He nodded slowly. Then he pushed the archival box across the table toward her. She was reaching for it when her phone rang again. Not Satterly this time. A Pine Hollow number she didn't recognize. She picked up. "Carter." The voice on the other end was Nate Briggs, and it was tight in the way that meant he'd been sitting on the call for a few minutes before he made it. "Something happened this morning," he said. "In town. You need to know." "Tell me." "Warren Howell went to Evelyn's house last night. I don't know what was said. She's not answering her door. But this morning there were 2 men outside her cottage. They're not locals. They're not saying anything to anyone, just standing there." Emily's hand went tight on the phone. "Have you seen Evelyn at all this morning?" "No, that's why I'm calling." A pause. "Her lights are off. Her car's in the drive. It's 9:30, and her garden lights are always on by 8. Emily was already on her feet. Nate, she said, call the county sheriff. Not the local deputy, the county. Tell them you have a welfare concern for an elderly resident and you need someone there within 30 minutes. Don't go near the cottage yourself. Don't confront the men outside. Do you understand? Yeah, Do it now. I'll call you back. She hung up and looked at Hayes, who had read enough of the call in her face to be already standing. I have to go, she said. The documents? Take them, he said. I've been carrying them long enough. She grabbed the archival box and called Satterley while she was moving for the door. And when Satterley answered, she said, Evelyn Brooks may be in danger. There are unidentified men outside her house. I need the Pine Hollow team moving right now. And was in her rental car with the box in the passenger seat before Satterley had finished saying she was already making the call. She drove with one hand and dialed Evelyn's number with the other.
Rang 4 times. 5. 6. On the 7th ring, someone picked up. Not Evelyn. The breathing on the other end was male and deliberate, and said nothing at all. Emily did not hang up. She kept the phone pressed to her ear and drove with her left hand and said nothing, because whoever was on the other end had made a choice to pick up instead of letting it ring out. And that choice meant something. It meant they wanted her to know someone was there. It meant they were making a point. I'm going to need to speak to Evelyn, she said. Her voice came out level, which was a small mechanical achievement. Nothing. I know you can hear me. I'm telling you that there are county sheriff units en route to that address right now. And there is an active military investigation that has been running for 11 months and escalated to a formal track in the last 18 hours. Whatever you're doing in that house, you are doing it inside a closing window. Breathing. Then the line went dead. She called Satterley back without lowering the phone from her ear. Someone picked up Evelyn's line and didn't speak, she said the moment Satterley connected, then disconnected. The team is 7 minutes out. Satterley's voice had the clipped quality of someone managing 3 things at once. County sheriff has been notified. Emily, I need you to not be in Pine Hollow for the next 2 hours. I'm in Arizona. Good. Stay there. A beat. The documents from Hayes, are they with you? In my passenger seat. There's a CID agent named Rosario flying into Tucson in 4 hours. She'll meet you at the airport. I need you to hand the box to her directly, not to anyone else, not through the airline, directly to her. She'll have credentials. Understood. Emily ran a yellow light and told herself to breathe properly. What's happening with Howell? We're looking at him. The financial thread from the records audit, the shell company, it incorporates to an entity called Harlan Civic Holdings. Harlan was the name of Warren Howell's father. Emily's grip on the wheel tightened. He inherited it, the whole operation. His father sets it up to protect Ash and move money, and Warren Howell has been maintaining it ever since. For 38 years. The entity is still active, Emily. It's not dormant. There have been transactions as recently as 14 months ago. She didn't ask what the transactions were for. She could guess. Maintenance of silence cost money the same way everything else did. People who'd been quiet for decades didn't stay quiet for free. The men outside Evelyn's house, she said, Howell sent them. Almost certainly, which means he knew the investigation was moving and he panicked. A pause. Panicked people do stupid things. And the stupid thing he did is going to be the last mistake he makes, because those men outside that cottage are going to be identified, and their connection to Howell is going to be the thread that unravels everything he's been protecting since 1988. Emily exhaled slowly. Is Evelyn okay? I don't know yet. 7 minutes. She drove and waited and told herself the same thing she told herself in trauma bays when a patient was beyond her reach, and all she could do was manage the variables in her immediate control. Work the problem in front of you. The problem in front of her was getting to Tucson and handing a gray archival box to a woman named Rosario. She drove. The 7 minutes became 12 by the time the Pine Hollow team reached Maple Creek. She found out later they'd hit road construction on the county route, and what they found when they got there was not what Emily had feared. Evelyn was in her kitchen. She was sitting at her table with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and the back door of the cottage was standing open, and the 2 men who had been outside were gone. They'd left when the sheriff cruiser turned onto a road, which told you exactly what they were. Not professionals, not anyone who had been trained to hold a position, just men who'd been paid to stand outside a door and make an old woman afraid to open it. Evelyn told the sheriff's deputy, when he came in, that Warren Howell had knocked on her door at 8:30 that morning, that he'd stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where Emily had drunk tea 4 days earlier, and told her in a quiet and pleasant voice that it would be in everyone's best interest if she allowed the questions that were currently being asked on her behalf to stop being asked, that he understood she'd had a difficult time, that he wanted to help her avoid further unpleasantness. "What did you say?" the deputy asked. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I told him I'd been living with unpleasantness for 38 years, and I wasn't in the habit of trading it away for other people's comfort." She'd said that, and Howell had left, and the two men had appeared outside her house an hour later, and Evelyn had sat at her kitchen table and drunk tea and waited, because she had learned in 38 years that waiting was the one thing she was reliably good at. Emily heard all of this from Satterley, who heard it from the team lead on the ground, who was a warrant officer named Garrett, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news that turned out to be less bad than expected. "She's all right," Satterley said. "She's more than all right, honestly." She asked the deputy whether someone was going to arrest Warren Howell, and when he said he couldn't answer that right now, she said, "I'll wait," and stood up and put the kettle back on. Something loosened in Emily's chest that she hadn't fully registered was tight. "The men," she said. "Identified?" "One of them, local to the county, a guy named Purcell with 2 prior misdemeanors, and as of this morning, a phone with 12 texts from a number registered to a business account belonging to Harlan Civic Holdings. 12 texts. Starting 3 days ago, the day after you showed up at Howell's silver SUV on the road to the trailhead." Emily pulled into the Tucson Airport departures loop and sat in the car with the engine running. "He moved the moment I spooked him. He'd been watching you since day 2. Once you connected with Evelyn and stayed connected, he started making calls. The men outside the cottage were supposed to deliver a message. What he didn't understand—" Satterley paused, and Emily heard something that was almost satisfaction in her voice, was that by making that call, he created a paper trail between himself and the intimidation of a witness in an active federal investigation. "Federal," Emily said. "It escalated. As of this morning, the financial records are enough on their own, the shell company, the maintenance payments, the connection to Ash's discretionary account. But the text to Purcell put Howell in the position of actively obstructing. That's not a historical financial crime anymore. That's something a federal prosecutor can work with right now." Emily looked at the archival box in the passenger seat. "And Hayes's documents," she said, "are going to be the foundation of the military case. The routing record alone, showing Wren's statement went to Brandt and was buried, that's the documentary proof of the cover-up inside the chain of command. Combined with Wren's testimony, combined with the financial connection between Brandt and Ash." Satterley stopped. "Thomas Brooks is going to have his name corrected. I can say that with more certainty now than I could 12 hours ago." Emily sat with that for a moment. "Ash," she said, "is 81 years old with a cardiologist and a lawyer who's been on retainer for 20 years. Satterley's voice was level. "He's going to be named in the military record correction. His role in the cover-up is going to be documented formally and permanently. Whether a criminal prosecution moves forward at his age and with his health, that's not my call, and it's not yours. But his name goes on the record permanently. Hayes made me promise that. It's a promise we can keep." Agent Rosario was exactly what her name suggested. Compact, precise, the kind of woman who had perfected the art of being completely unremarkable in a public space while missing nothing. She found Emily at a coffee stand outside the security checkpoint, looked at her for 2 seconds, said "Carter," and that was the introduction. Emily handed her the archival box. Rosario took it with both hands, which Emily noticed. Not one hand, both. The way you carried something that had weight beyond its physical mass. "There's a chain of custody form," Rosario said, producing a clipboard from under her arm. Emily signed it. "The routing record is in the 3rd sleeve from the front," Emily said. "And the financial notation," Hayes made a handwritten note on the back of the per diem record that explains the Brandt-Ash connection. "Don't miss it. It's faint." Rosario looked at her with an expression that suggested she did not miss things. "Carter," she said, "you did good work." It was said simply, without performance, the way a professional told another professional that the handoff was clean. Emily nodded. Rosario walked away with both hands on the box and didn't look back. Emily bought coffee she didn't need and sat in the terminal and felt the specific deflation of a person whose purpose has just walked through a security checkpoint in someone else's hands. She'd felt it before. At the end of deployments, when the patients were transferred out and the tent was being broken down. The work was done, and the aftermath was someone else's job, and you were supposed to feel relief, but mostly you felt the absence of forward motion. She booked a flight back to Montana, not because she needed to be there, because Evelyn was there, and there was something unfinished in the cottage on the edge of town that had nothing to do with evidence chains or federal investigations, something that was just one person sitting across a table from another and saying, "I saw this. It was real. You were right." She landed in Missoula and rented a car and drove the 2 hours to Pine Hollow in the late afternoon, and the town looked the same as it always did. Small, in particular, with its hand-painted diner sign and its bench outside the hardware store and its strip of main road that you could drive end to end in 40 seconds. But something in it felt different, and it took her until she turned onto Evelyn's road to understand what it was. The silver SUV was not parked anywhere she could see. She found out why when she reached the diner and Nate Briggs texted her. Howell was brought in for questioning this morning. His assistant is running the bank. The whole town knows. She sat in the car outside Evelyn's cottage for a moment. Then she texted back, "How are people taking it?" A pause. Quietly. Like when something you suspected for a long time turns out to be true, and you don't know what to do with the confirmation. She got out of the car. Evelyn answered the door before she knocked. She'd heard the car, Emily realized, the way you learn to track sounds when you'd been alone for a long time. She looked the same as she always did, and also not the same. Something in her posture was marginally different, not taller, not more open, just less braced. The perpetual subtle preparation for an impact that might or might not come. "Come in," she said. They sat in the kitchen, and Evelyn made tea, and Emily drank it this time and told her, all of it, the parts she hadn't been able to tell while it was still moving. Wren and Hayes and the archival box with the routing record, the texts on Purcell's phone, the escalation to federal. Evelyn listened without interrupting, which was how she'd been trained by 38 years of people not finishing sentences they'd started in her direction. When Emily finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. "Ash," she said, "he's still alive." "He is." "They'll name him in the record." "Yes." Evelyn turned her cup in her hands. "Thomas used to say that he didn't need people to like him. He just needed the record to be accurate." A pause. "He said that. I don't know where a 23-year-old gets that, but he said it." Emily looked at her. "It's going to be accurate." The words sat between them. Then Evelyn nodded, once, the kind of nod that was less agreement than acknowledgement. "Something has landed. Something is real. I'm putting it down in the place where real things go." But the next 4 days moved in the way that things moved when a system had been kicked into motion. Not fast, not smooth, but with a gathering quality like water finding a channel. The Army's formal notification came on the 3rd day. A letter to Evelyn Brooks, addressed with her full name and the correct address, informing her that the case file of Corporal Thomas Arthur Brooks had been reopened under a military records correction proceeding, that new evidence had been received and was under formal review, and that she would be kept informed of all developments through a designated point of contact. The designated point of contact was Major Doris Satterley. Evelyn read the letter twice at the kitchen table, while Emily sat across from her, and then she folded it along its original creases and put it in the cedar box with Thomas's letters, and she didn't say anything for a full minute. Then, they spelled his middle name right, Arthur. People always put Alan. Emily didn't trust herself to answer that, so she didn't. Warren Howell was arrested on the 4th day. Not in the bank, not in the parking lot of some government building. He was arrested at 7 in the morning outside his house, in the particular gray light of a Montana morning,
by 2 federal agents and a county sheriff's deputy who had driven out from Missoula. He was wearing a fleece vest and holding car keys, which meant he'd been about to go somewhere, and the arrest happened before he got there. Nate texted Emily a picture of the street afterward, not of Howell, just of the street, with the federal vehicles and the small cluster of neighbors who had come out at the sound of it. Small town. Sound traveled. It was quiet, Nate wrote. He didn't say anything. Just looked at his house like he was trying to remember something about it. Emily thought about Harold Briggs on his porch on Maple Creek Road, watching the fields like they owed him something. She texted Nate, "Tell your grandfather it moved." The reply, after a few minutes, was just, "He already knows. He's been up since 5, Ike." But the formal charges came out the following week, and they were more specific than Emily had expected, which meant the federal prosecutors had found more in Harlan Civic Holdings than Satterley had initially seen. The shell company had been used to funnel payments to 3 individuals over a period spanning from 1989 to the previous year. One was the deputy who had been the town's law enforcement contact in 1988, dead for 11 years, no recovery there. One was a records clerk at the state level whose name Emily didn't recognize. And one was a retired newspaper editor in Billings who had, in 1993, received a sum of money that coincided precisely with the month the Billings Tribune's archive of the Gail Turo article had disappeared. That detail, the newspaper editor, broke something open in the town in a way that even Howell's arrest had not. Because most of Pine Hollow had been able to hold somewhere a version of events in which the 1988 story was genuine and Evelyn was wrong, and the town's behavior had been unfortunate but not monstrous. The version where the evidence was real and their consensus had formed around real evidence. The newspaper editor meant the evidence had been managed. The story that reached them had been shaped by money. They had not formed a consensus around truth. They had formed a consensus around a purchased version of events, and the difference between those two things was not something you could sit comfortably with. Gary Pruitt came to Evelyn's cottage on a Thursday afternoon. Emily was there. She saw him pull up and she watched from the window while Evelyn went to the door, and she stayed in the kitchen because this was not her moment. She could hear the conversation through the screen door, but she didn't try to make out the words. What she could hear was the quality of it, Pruitt's voice low and without its usual forward weight, Evelyn's voice steady and giving nothing away. Short sentences. A pause that went on long enough that Emily almost moved toward the door. Then the screen door closed and Evelyn came back to the kitchen alone. "What did he say?" Emily asked. Evelyn sat down. "He said he was sorry." She was quiet for a moment. "And that he didn't know. About the payments. About the editor." A pause. "I don't know if that's true." "Does it matter?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. "Ask me in a year." It was, Emily thought, the most honest answer available. Satterley flew in on a Friday. She came in a rental car from Missoula like a civilian, in civilian clothes, and she met Emily at the second diner, the one with the slightly better pie, and she ate a piece of peach without ceremony and said, "The Records Correction Board met Wednesday." Emily set her fork down. "Thomas Arthur Brooks," Satterley said, "is going to receive a posthumous honorable discharge and a formal expungement of all findings from the 1988 proceeding. The board found, based on Hayes's documentation and Wren's testimony, that the investigation was materially compromised by the deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence at the direction of Colonel Vernon Ashe, facilitated by Lieutenant Colonel Brandt, and enabled by the financial structure maintained by Harlan Civic Holdings." Emily looked at the table. "Ashe," she said, "has been formally notified of his named role in the corruption finding. His military record is being amended. There is an active criminal referral. His attorney has already been in contact with the DOJ." Satterley paused. "He's 81, and he has a pacemaker and a lawyer who will work very hard to keep this from reaching a courtroom. But his name is on the finding, Emily, permanently. In the official military record, for anyone who looks, his name is there." Emily picked her fork back up, set it back down. "The ceremony," she said. "Evelyn should be there when Thomas's honor is officially restored." "That's actually what I need to talk to you about."
Satterley looked at her across the table with the expression she used when she was about to say something that she'd already decided and was informing rather than asking. The board wants to hold the ceremony here, Pine Hollow, not at a base, here, where this started. And they want you to stand with them. Emily looked up. I'm not active. You were 12 years ago, and you found the thread that moved a 38-year-old case in 8 days. Satterley raised an eyebrow. They're not asking you to wear the uniform. They're asking you to stand there, as a former member of the Army who did what the Army should have done a long time ago. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Evelyn first, she said. Whatever the ceremony looks like, Evelyn walks in before anyone else. Obviously, Satterley said, and ate the rest of her pie. Matisham. It was 11 days after Howell's arrest, 4 days before the ceremony, when Emily went back to the hardware store. Not for anything. She'd been walking, genuinely walking this time, not processing, not planning, just moving through the town that had become temporarily familiar, and she passed the store, and on an impulse she went in. The man at the counter was not the owner. It was a teenage boy who looked up from his phone with the guilty speed of someone caught doing the thing their employer had told them not to do on shift. She looked around the store for a moment. Work gloves she wasn't going to buy, cans of something, a display of pocket knives. Then she turned to go, and Ranger was standing in the open doorway. He was with a handler this time, a young soldier in civilian clothes with the regulation haircut that gave him away, a guy, maybe 24, who looked slightly embarrassed. Ma'am, the handler said. Sorry about this. He does this sometimes in unfamiliar towns, goes toward familiar. Emily looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at her with his usual quality of paying complete attention. He found me in my yard my first week here, she said. The handler nodded. He does that. We were told about... He stopped. He's good at finding the right people. Emily crouched down and looked at the dog for a moment. Ranger's tail moved once. Good boy, she said, the same thing she'd said the first time, in the same tone. You did your job. She stood up and walked out of the store into the afternoon, and she didn't look back, but she heard the handler say something quiet to the dog, and she heard Ranger's feet on the wooden boards as he turned to follow. And something in the sequence of it, dog, handler, afternoon, wooden boards, had the particular quality of a thing that is complete. She was halfway down the main road when her phone rang. Satterley. We have a problem, Satterley said, and her voice had the register Emily recognized from the worst calls. The DOJ referral on Ash, his attorney made a counterfiling this morning. They're arguing the records correction proceeding was procedurally compromised. Emily stopped walking. On what grounds? They're claiming Hayes's documents were improperly obtained, that Hayes was induced to hand them over by a private citizen operating outside any official capacity, and that the chain of custody is therefore tainted. A pause. They named you, Emily. They're filing a motion to exclude the documents from the formal record. She stood in the middle of Pine Hollow's main road with the mountains behind her and the diner sign ahead of her and the bench outside the hardware store empty in the afternoon light. Can they make that argument stick? She said. Their lawyer is very good, Satterley said carefully. And the chain of custody form Rosario had you sign at the airport. It accurately reflects that you handed the box directly to a federal agent, which is fine. But the predicate transaction, Hayes voluntarily giving the documents to a private citizen, is something they can argue was induced under false pretenses. I told him exactly who I was and what I was doing. I know that. You know that. His lawyer is going to argue that a vulnerable elderly man was manipulated by someone presenting herself as having authority she didn't have. A pause. It's a bad faith argument. But it's a credible enough argument that a judge might grant a preliminary hearing, and if that hearing delays the records correction... The ceremony is in 4 days. I know. Evelyn is 82 years old. I know, Emily. She looked at the empty bench. What do we need? We need Hayes's direct testimony, his own account of the voluntary nature of the transfer, given under oath. We need it on record before Ash's attorney can get a hearing date. Satterley's voice was tight. And we need it in the next 48 hours. Hayes is in Arizona. I can have him on a flight tonight. He's 76. He has a bad hip. I can't... I'll ask him, Emily said. He can decide. She was already pulling up his contact before Satterley finished the sentence, and when Hayes picked up on the second ring, she told him what she'd just been told, straight and without softening it, because he'd earned the unvarnished version. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that she counted her own breaths. Then Hayes said, "What's the earliest flight out of Tucson?" And that was when Emily understood, with a certainty that settled in her bones rather than her brain, that this was not over, that Ash's attorney had read the room correctly, that the documents alone were not going to be enough, that there was one more thing required before the record was clean. She booked Hayes on the 7 p.m. flight, and then she stood on the main road of Pine Hollow with the mountains at her back and called Satterley back and said, "He's coming." But if Ash's attorney files that preliminary motion before Hayes testifies, can they freeze the records correction in place? The pause on Satterley's end told her the answer before the words did. "Yes," Satterley said. "If the judge grants the hearing before the correction is finalized, they can put a temporary hold on everything, including the ceremony." Emily looked at the bench. She thought about Evelyn saying, "I'll wait to a county sheriff's deputy," and putting the kettle back on. She thought about 38 years as a unit of time, what it looked like, what it cost, what a person became inside it. "How fast can Ash's attorney move?" she asked. "His assistant called the court clerk's office at 2:15 this afternoon," Satterley said. "Filing window closes at 5. Emily looked at her watch. It was 4:47. Emily was already moving before she finished the thought. Not running, walking fast, the controlled pace of someone who had learned that running in a crisis made other people panic and panic cost time. She went through the diner door and the teenager at the counter looked up and she said, "Is there a fax machine in this town that still works?" He blinked. "The library, 2 blocks. She went. The Pine Hollow Public Library was a single-room building that smelled like old carpet and had operating hours posted on the door in a font that belonged to 1994. It was open. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain looked up from the front desk. "Fax machine," Emily said. "I need it right now. It's urgent." The librarian, her name tag said Patricia, looked at her for exactly 1 second with the expression of a woman who had assessed many situations across this desk and knew a real one when she saw it. "Back left corner," she said, 25 cents a page. Emily didn't have the document she needed to fax. She needed Satterley to fax something, but not to the court. To Hayes's attorney, if Hayes had one, or directly to Hayes himself, so that Hayes could call the court clerk's office before 5 and put a formal statement of voluntary cooperation on record before Ash's attorney's filing window closed. She called Satterley while she walked to the back left corner. "I need Hayes's attorney's contact or Hayes's direct fax number if he has one, and I need you to draft a 1-page voluntary disclosure statement for Hayes to sign and call in to the court clerk before 5, she said without preamble. "We don't stop Ash's motion at the filing level. We make the motion pointless before it's filed. If Hayes's statement of voluntary cooperation is already in the court record when Ash's attorney files, the predicate argument collapses." Satterley was quiet for 2 seconds. Yes, that works. Get the fax number to me." Emily looked at the machine. It had a number on a sticker on the top panel, the kind of sticker that had been there since the machine was installed. She read it to Satterley. 4 minutes, Satterley said, and hung up. Patricia had appeared at the end of the row of shelves without making any sound about it, holding a small jar of coins. "No charge?" she said simply, and set the jar on the table next to the machine, and walked back to her desk without further comment. The fax came through in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 2 pages, a cover sheet from Satterley's office, and a single-page document that was clean and spare and said, in formal language, that Daniel Hayes, former CID warrant officer, had voluntarily transferred custody of personal investigative records to Emily Carter, private citizen, in full knowledge of the legal context and without inducement or misrepresentation, and that he affirmed the document's provenance and authenticity and offered to provide sworn testimony to that effect. There was a signature line. Hayes's name was typed under it. She called Hayes. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been sitting with his phone in his hand. "I need you to call a number," she said, and gave him the court clerk's number for the district. Tell them you're Daniel Hayes, and you need to file a supplementary statement in the matter of the Brooks Records correction proceeding. They'll ask for a case number. She gave him the number Satterley had put in the header of the fax. They'll probably tell you the window is closing. Tell them you're aware of that and you need 30 seconds. Then read them the statement I'm about to read you. She read him the statement, slowly. He didn't stop her or ask her to repeat anything. When she finished, he said, "Emily." "Yes." "If this works, make the call, Hayes." She heard him exhale. Then the line shifted. He'd put her on hold, which meant he was dialing the clerk's office on another line. She stood in the back left corner of the Pine Hollow Library next to a fax machine from approximately 2003 and looked at the spines of the books on the shelf in front of her and breathed. Patricia was typing something at her desk. The building made the particular sounds of an old building settling. 4 minutes passed. Hayes came back on the line. "They took it," he said. "Filed at 4:59. The clerk read it back to confirm." Emily put one hand on the shelf. "Okay," she said. "Get on the plane tonight." "I'll be there," he said. She walked back to Evelyn's cottage in the dark. It was past 8 by the time she got there, and the lights were on inside, yellow and warm through the curtained windows. And when Evelyn answered the door, she was in a cardigan and had a book open in her hand with her finger keeping the page, the specific posture of a person who has learned to fill silence with something useful. "Sit down," Emily said. "I have things to tell you." She told her about Ash's attorney's motion and the fax and Hayes's call to the court clerk. She told it simply, without the procedural weight, because Evelyn didn't need the procedural weight. She needed to know that someone had tried to stop it, and hadn't, and that the ceremony in 4 days was still standing. Evelyn listened with her book closed in her lap. 4:59, she said when Emily finished. 4:59. The old woman looked at the book in her lap. Then she set it on the table beside her and said, "Thomas used to leave things to the last minute. Not because he was careless, he said it focused him." She paused. "I hated it." Emily almost laughed. She was more surprised by the almost laugh than by anything that had happened in the last 2 hours. "Hayes is coming tomorrow," Emily said. "He wants to meet you." Evelyn looked up. "He's the one who wrote the statement down," Emily said. "In 1988, he believed Wren, he believed Thomas." The old woman was very still for a moment. "He lost his career over it. He made choices that cost him things, same as you." Evelyn looked at her hands. "I'd like to meet him," she said quietly. Hayes arrived in Missoula on the 9 p.m. flight and drove himself to Pine Hollow in a rental car, which Emily had tried to argue against on account of his hip and the 2-hour drive in the dark, and which he had declined to be argued out of. He checked into the Millbrook rental, not Emily's unit, the other one, smaller, that had been vacant since she'd arrived, and she saw his light on at 11 p.m. when she came back from a walk she hadn't planned to take but had needed. He met Evelyn the next morning. Emily drove him to the cottage and let him knock on the door himself, and stepped back to the car and sat on the hood and looked at the mountains while the door opened and closed, and whatever was going to happen inside happened without her in the room. She was still on the car hood 40 minutes later when Hayes came back out. He walked carefully, the hip was real, and he sat in the passenger seat with the door open and put his hands on his knees and didn't say anything for a while. Emily didn't ask. After a few minutes, he said, "She showed me his letters." "Yeah. He wrote well for a kid." She mentioned he was precise. Hayes looked at the cottage. "She's not angry at me." "Did you expect her to be?" "I don't know what I expected." He shook his head. "She said she didn't blame the people who were scared. She said she'd only ever blame the people who were in a position not to be scared and chose it anyway." Emily thought about Ash in Scottsdale with his pacemaker and his lawyer. "That's a precise distinction," she said. "She's a precise woman." Hayes was quiet for another moment. "She asked me if I thought Thomas knew, if he understood what was happening to him at the end." Emily looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I thought he knew the charge was false. I said I thought he died knowing his own record." He paused. "She said that was enough, that knowing your own record was enough." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know if that's true." Emily didn't know either,
She thought it might be the kind of thing that was true for some people and not others, and that the difference had less to do with the circumstances and more to do with something unteachable. It was enough for her, she said. That's not nothing. Yeah. The day before the ceremony, Gail Turo came to Pine Hollow. She was 63 now, retired from journalism, living in Billings with a garden she'd mentioned in 3 separate emails to Satterley's office after the investigation became public. She drove herself down and arrived in the late afternoon and went straight to Evelyn's cottage, because she said she'd been wanting to do that since 1993 and had spent 30 years being afraid of what Harlan Civic Holdings would do if she showed her face in this town. Emily met her briefly at Evelyn's kitchen table, where they drank tea, and Turo explained, with the directness of a journalist who had made peace with her own part in the story, that she had known, after the article was killed, that there was more to it, that she had kept her notes, that her notes were now with the federal prosecutor's office as supporting material for the timeline. The editor who buried it, Turo said. He called me himself after the arrest, said he was sorry, said he hadn't known what Howell's father was connected to. She paused. I told him I believed him, and I didn't feel better. Evelyn looked at her. Believing someone and forgiving them aren't the same thing. No, Turo said. They're not. They sat with that for a moment, 3 women at a kitchen table in Montana, with the late afternoon light coming through the curtain and the cedar box on its shelf by the window. The morning of the ceremony was overcast, which suited Pine Hollow better than sunshine would have. The Army sent 7 people, including a brigadier general named Aldous Fenn, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had been in formal situations long enough that he no longer needed to perform dignity, he just had it. He arrived an hour early and walked the town's main road alone, which Emily watched from the diner window and thought was either instinct or protocol, and probably both. The ceremony was held in the small park at the end of Pine Hollow's main road. Not a grand space, just a patch of grass with a flagpole and 2 benches and a view of the mountain range that on clear days was extraordinary and on overcast days was present in a different way, closer, more immediate. Most of the town came. Not all. There were a few notable absences, including Gary Pruitt, which Emily noted and set aside. But most of them came, and they stood in the particular configuration of people who are not sure what their presence means but have decided it means something. Nate Briggs was there, standing with Harold, who had made the drive in from Maple Creek Road in the truck he kept up, even though it was old. Harold stood straight for a man of 80 with bad knees, and he kept his eyes on the flagpole for most of the ceremony, which Emily understood was how some people held difficult things, by looking at something stable while the weight moved through them. Evelyn arrived on foot. She had asked to walk, not drive, which meant she came down the main road the way she'd walked it for 38 years, past the diner, past the hardware store, past the bench. But this time people turned when they saw her coming, and they made room, and nobody looked through her. She was wearing a blue dress she'd had for many years. She was carrying her purse. She walked at the pace of an 82-year-old woman who was going to take the time she needed, and the crowd around the park opened without anyone having to ask it to. Hayes was already standing near the front. His hip had kept him from walking from the rental, and Emily had driven him, and he'd been standing for 30 minutes when Evelyn arrived, because he'd said he wasn't going to be sitting when she got there. When she reached him, she stopped. They looked at each other. He said something Emily couldn't hear. Evelyn nodded once, the same kind of nod as before. Something is real. I'm putting it down in the place where real things go. And then she put her hand briefly on his arm and moved forward to the place that had been kept for her at the front. General Fenn did not give a long speech. He said that the Army's purpose, at its best, was to find the truth and stand in front of it, that it had failed to do that in the case of Corporal Thomas Arthur Brooks, and that the failure had been deliberate, and that the people responsible had been named, and the naming was permanent. He said Thomas Brooks had followed orders he'd been told were legitimate, had done his duty with the information available to him, and had died waiting for a hearing that should have cleared him in its first session. He said that the record now reflected all of this, and that the record would not be altered again. Then he turned to Evelyn. He did not hand her a folded flag. Thomas had not had a proper military burial, and the gesture would have been hollow. He handed her a different document,
A formal letter from the Secretary of the Army, bearing a seal and a signature, stating that the findings against Corporal Thomas Arthur Brooks had been expunged in full, that his record reflected an honorable service and a wrongful accusation, and that the Army acknowledged, in formal and permanent terms, its institutional failure to protect one of its own. Evelyn took the letter with both hands. She didn't read it. She already knew what it said. Satterley had read it to her the night before, which Emily had thought was exactly the right call. Evelyn deserved to hear those words privately first, before she had to hold them in public. She held the letter and looked at it, and the overcast morning did what overcast mornings do, which is provide a particular kind of light that is even in gray and makes everything that happens in it feel simultaneously smaller and more real. Then Fenn said her name, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, and he stepped back, and the soldiers behind him came to attention, all 7 of them, in full dress, in Pine Hollow Park, for an 82-year-old woman who had been eating sandwiches alone on a bench for 38 years. The salute held for 5 seconds. There was no sound in the park except the flag line clicking against the pole in the light wind. Emily was standing to the side, away from the front, in the position she'd chosen deliberately, present but not central, because this moment had been 38 years in the making and none of those years belonged to her. She had 8 days in it. Evelyn had all the rest. She felt Satterley step up beside her. "You should be up there," Satterley said quietly. "I'm fine here." "Emily." "I'm fine here," she said again, and meant it. After. That was always the part that nobody talked about, the after. The ceremony ends and the camera, metaphorically, doesn't know where to point, because the resolution has happened and the human beings involved still have to figure out what to do with their hands. Evelyn was surrounded by people she'd been invisible to for decades, and she handled it with the grace of someone who had processed this possibility many times in private and arrived at the event already at peace with the imperfection of it. Some of the people who spoke to her were genuine. Some of them were performing. She received all of them with the same measured courtesy, which Emily recognized as a kind of mastery, not coldness, not performance, but the hard-won ability to accept what was offered without needing it to be more than it was. Harold Briggs got to her eventually. He stood in front of her and he didn't make a speech. He said something short, and she said something back, and he put his hand out, and she took it, and they stood like that for a moment. 2 old people, 2 long waits, a handshake that contained about a decade of things neither of them had been able to say when they should have. Nate watched from a few feet back, and Emily caught his eye across the grass, and he made a small gesture with his chin that meant thank you in the language of people who are not comfortable with the actual words. She nodded. General Fenn found her by the far edge of the park, where she'd gone to stand with her coffee. The diner had sent out a thermos and paper cups, which was exactly the right call for Pine Hollow, and he stood beside her for a moment without preamble. "Carter," he said. "Sir?" "Major Satterley tells me you came here on vacation." "Technically." He looked out at the gathered people. "How are your hiking boots?" She looked down at them, same scuff on the left toe from the route on Tuesday, 3 weeks ago now. "Functional." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something without it being official." "Go ahead." "What you did, the way you did it, is the kind of thing that the Army does badly at recognizing because it doesn't fit a category. You didn't break protocol exactly, and you didn't follow it exactly. You used what you had, and you moved in the right direction, and you handed it off when it was right to hand it off." He paused. "That's harder than either of the clean options. People who do it well usually do it quietly, and nobody writes it down." Emily looked at him. "Is that what you wanted to say?" "I wanted you to know that it was seen," he said simply. "People spend whole careers not being seen. I didn't want that to happen here." She looked back at the park, at Evelyn, who was now laughing, genuinely laughing, at something Harold had said, a laugh that started slow and then opened up, a sound that felt like a room airing out after a long winter. "It didn't happen here," Emily said. "Thank you, sir." Warren Howell's formal charges were filed 11 days after the ceremony. Obstruction of a federal investigation, financial fraud spanning 3 decades, conspiracy to suppress evidence in a military proceeding. The list was specific and long and public, published in the county record and picked up by the Billings Tribune, The same paper that had buried the 1993 article, and by two national outlets that ran brief items about the case. Ash's attorney's motion was denied 4 days after Hayes's statement was filed, which meant it died before it had fully lived, and the denial was based on the voluntary nature of the document transfer and the integrity of the chain of custody. The DOJ referral on Ash moved slowly. The attorney was, as Satterley had predicted, very good, but the military record stood regardless. His name was there. Every person who looked at the official history of the 1988 proceeding would read it. That was not nothing. It was in fact the thing Hayes had asked for, the thing Evelyn had never stopped needing, and the thing the system had spent 38 years denying, a name in the right place in the record. Harlan Civic Holdings was dissolved by court order the following month. The assets, there were more than expected, accumulated across 3 decades of quiet maintenance money, were frozen pending the federal investigation. The records clerk in the state system who'd received payments was suspended pending review. The editor's estate, more complicated legally, became its own procedural matter that would take years to resolve. These things move slowly. That's their nature. The machinery of accountability grinds at its own pace, and sometimes the pace feels like a personal insult to everyone who waited for it. But it moves. Emily had learned in 12 years of a job where the paperwork outlasted the crisis that the moving was the point, that the record being set in motion was itself a form of arrival, not a preliminary to it. She left Pine Hollow on a Thursday morning. She'd meant to leave on the Monday after the ceremony, but there had been things. Hayes needed a ride to the airport, and then Evelyn had asked her to come by, and Emily had stayed for 3 hours without meaning to. And then there had been a conversation with Nate that turned into 2 conversations, and before she'd fully registered the days accumulating, she'd been in Pine Hollow for 3 weeks total, which was 2.5 more than her mandatory vacation had technically required. Her last morning, she walked the main road one more time. The diner was open. The hardware store was open. The bench outside the hardware store was empty in the early morning light, not ominously, just ordinarily, the way a bench is empty when no one happens to be sitting on it yet. She stopped at the bench and looked at it for a moment. The wood was old but solid. Someone had painted it at some point, the paint wearing thin in the places that bore weight. 38 years of weather. 38 years of a woman sitting on it because the alternative was inside a building that didn't want her. She thought about the first time she'd seen Evelyn, the particular quality of the woman's stillness, the held posture of someone waiting for impact, the way she'd looked at Emily when she sat down, checking for the catch. Emily had said, "Just coffee," and it had been true, and the truth of it had taken Evelyn by surprise, which said everything about what the previous years had taught her to expect. She thought about what it cost a person to keep believing something that no one around them would confirm, to hold a truth alone for 38 years without anyone standing beside it with you. Most people couldn't do it. Most people, after enough time, would begin to doubt their own memory, to wonder if maybe the world that disagreed with them was seeing something they'd missed. Evelyn hadn't done that. She was imperfect in her own ways. There was bitterness in her occasionally that she didn't always manage. There were days when the isolation had made her sharper than she wanted to be. She wasn't a saint. She was a woman who had held on to accurate information because she couldn't make herself let go of it. And that stubbornness, which had looked like grief to the people around her, had turned out to be the thing that kept the thread intact until someone came along who knew what to do with it. Emily sat down on the bench. She didn't stay long, 15 minutes maybe, with her coffee getting cold and the morning coming up properly around her. But she sat there on purpose, on the bench on the main road of Pine Hollow, Montana, in the way that she hadn't been able to sit beside Evelyn in the ceremony because the moment hadn't belonged to her. This one she could have. She thought about Private Delgado and the storage tent and the dream she still had. She thought about 12 years of putting her hands on people in the worst moments of their lives and doing everything available, and sometimes it being enough and sometimes not. She thought about the particular ache of watching a system make the wrong call and not having the leverage to move it, the way that felt like shouting into a room where everyone had already made up their mind. She'd had leverage here. 8 days of it, in the right place, at the right time, with the right thread. That was luck as much as anything. The luck of stopping in a particular small town and sitting down on a particular bench and buying a particular cup of coffee. She knew that. She wasn't going to pretend the outcome had been inevitable, but she also knew what she'd done with the luck. She'd paid attention. She'd trusted the pattern she recognized. She'd handed things off when they needed to be handed off, and pushed when they needed to be pushed, and sat with a man in a kitchen in Arizona and let him give her something heavy that he'd been carrying too long. She'd done the thing that was available to do. That was all it ever was. Not heroics, not certainty, just the thing that was available, executed as cleanly as possible, with the full knowledge that it might not be enough, and the decision to do it anyway. She finished the coffee and stood up. Down the main road, the door of the diner opened, and the woman who'd told her to be careful about getting too close to Evelyn Brooks came out to flip the open sign. She saw Emily and paused. Emily raised her empty cup. The woman held the door open a beat longer than she needed to. Then she nodded, small, not quite comfortable, but present, and went back inside. It was not absolution. It was not friendship. It was a nod on a Thursday morning from a person who was still working out what she'd been part of for 38 years. Emily would take it. Yeah. She got in the car and drove. She didn't know where she was going after Montana. There was no plan. Major Satterley had not called with a posting, and Emily hadn't looked at the paperwork for returning to active service, and the question of what came next was still open in a way that felt less frightening than it had 3 weeks ago. Things that had been open before Pine Hollow felt differently open now. Not answered, just differently shaped. She was 2 miles out of town when she saw Ranger. He was standing at the side of the road with his handler, the young soldier with the regulation haircut, and they were clearly on a routine run, the dog in his working vest and the handler in civilian running gear. As her car passed, Ranger's head turned and tracked her. She didn't stop. She kept driving. But she looked in the rearview mirror, and the dog was still watching the car, and he stayed watching until the road curved and the sight line broke. She drove with the mountains on her left and the flatland opening on her right, and the particular silence of a car that contains only one person and is pointed toward something undefined. She'd come to Pine Hollow to stop moving. What she'd found was that sometimes stopping in the right place was its own kind of motion. That stillness chose you as much as you chose it, and what you did in the stillness was the only part you actually controlled. She'd sat down on a bench and bought a cup of coffee and paid attention. That was the whole of it, stripped back. The rest had followed from that, the way everything followed from the first decision to engage, messily, incompletely, with wrong turns and 48-hour holds, and a fax machine in a library, and a document handed off in an airport with both hands. The record was accurate now. Thomas Brooks's name was in the right place. Evelyn Brooks had heard soldiers come to attention for her in the town that had looked through her for 38 years. And somewhere in that cottage at the edge of Pine Hollow, an old woman was probably in her garden right now, or making tea, or reading the book she'd had open when Emily arrived 3 weeks ago, living her ordinary life in the town that was still, imperfectly, haltingly, beginning to look at her. That wasn't a perfect ending. It was a real one, which was harder to achieve and more durable. Emily had seen enough of both kinds to know the difference. She pressed the accelerator and drove into the open land, and the mountains behind her were very still in the rearview mirror. And somewhere in Pine Hollow, a bench sat empty on the main road, waiting for whoever needed it next. That was the truth about justice, she thought. It didn't complete itself and step back and let you admire it. It moved into the next thing. It required the next person. The record got corrected, and then someone had to live in the corrected world and build something in it, and then someone after them. And the chain of small decisions to pay attention was the only thing that kept the correction from drifting back into silence. She had done her part of the chain. Somewhere, the next link was already waiting. She drove.